Hello, welcome to the Class Insights podcast. I'm Tyson Blauer. I'm a research director here at Class, and I'm joined by Paul Warburton.
Yeah, thanks, Tyson. I'm Analyst over here at Class, working heavily on all of our EMR market segments.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about the report that we worked on together, our annual acute EMR market share report. And this is always a fun report to put together. And Paul, I'm curious, you've done this for years. What are the big takeaways that you saw from this last year's report?
So one of the biggest takeaways, and many providers and clinicians and provider organizations that we talk to are talking about the same thing, and it's really what's happening around Meditech. And one of the biggest things is in previous years, they've kind of had an up and down. Some years they're net positive on their growth, some years it's been negative. One of the things about this year, not only are they net positive on their market share growth, but they're also seeing a much higher percentage of their of customer retention. So that big legacy Meditech customer base that's sitting out there, many more of them that made go forward decisions actually ended up picking Expanse than in previous years. You know, they almost doubled that retention percentage this year.
Yeah, that's really interesting. If you're a Meditech customer, seeing the change that's happening there, especially if you're running Magic or CS or something else like that, they're having a lot of traction there with that legacy Meditech base.
And one of the macro level trends that we've noticed, especially after coming off a COVID year, is providers more than anything, they're looking for consistency, security. And so what that's telling us is that many more of the legacy customers, they're now seeing Expanse as that consistent, hey, I can expect them to perform this way for me. And they're getting more of a track record in that community space when Expanse than they've had previously.
Yeah, and it really does take that track record. I think that's something we see every year is those vendors who have really consistent performance continue to do well with that market share. And we've seen that with Expanse where it's been consistent for years, but it's, starting back in 2016, now we're starting to see those benefits where things are really turned around. You're seeing that high retention rate, you're seeing a lot of new customers coming in, and other vendors who have not been as consistent, you see them continue to be more volatile where they may have more sales and more losses as well.
And when we talk about track record, and especially a consistent track record, it's hard to skip over Epic and what they've been doing in the large acute space. Can you summarize what's been happening there over 2021?
Yeah, well, it's the same thing we've been seeing for a while. Epic just continues to pick up these large organizations. They just almost have this gravitational pull around them where if you are around other Epic sites, you generally feel like you need to be moving to Epic. So whether that be for interoperability and needing to share data with these other sites, or maybe you're just getting gobbled up by one of these large health systems if you're a standalone hospital. So Epic's seeing a lot of movement still year over year. And what's really interesting to me is the continued lack of customers leaving. You can see in the report where they do lose a few, it's usually for things like, hey, the customer a hospital was acquired by somebody else, or there's some sort of standardization that happened. But we don't talk with customers who say, I'm dissatisfied with Epic and I'm leaving. And to do that consistently for as long as Epic has, that's highly unique. And that's not something that we see really any other vendor being able to replicate.
It really goes back to that whole idea of consistency. And more and more providers we talk to, they just tout that consistent experience of what Epic does, integrating all those pieces together, primarily across acute, ambulatory, and the financial side. But let's actually jump over to one of the other really interesting, I'll call it a nuance of 2021. So looking at this, I see Cerner, they actually increased their total number of hospitals.
Yep.
However, they decreased in their overall beds market share. Help me understand that.
Yeah, so this is where, as you look through our data, you've got to be able to look at the full story, and that's why we do so much in this space and get as many details as we do, because Cerner, yeah, they did win in terms of number of customers. They are picking up more, but they typically are more smaller hospitals, picking up on that community connect model. Customers who are larger, running on Millennium, those are the ones we generally see are leaving, and so it's really hard to sell enough small customers to make up for even one large health system leaving. So that's what we're seeing is Cerner's losing these larger customers and picking up these smaller deals. So they're doing really well in that smaller hospital market, but struggling with the larger customers.
Help me understand. So different places and people use community to mean different things. Here at Class, what do we mean when we say community hospital?
That's a good question. So generally we mean a hospital that's 1 to 200 beds. In fact, we actually made some pivots this year in the report to be a little bit more concise and consistent in how we're defining that. And so we are saying it's 1 to 200 beds, standalone hospitals in that,
Awesome.
or in that community space.
And Tyson, help me understand, because obviously how they make decisions is completely different than a large IDN makes decisions.
Yep.
So I know there's a lot more competitiveness between the vendors in that space, but help me understand what does that space look like?
Yeah, so if you're a small hospital, you don't have a lot of money. And so when you are picking a system, you're going to be married to that for a long time, for better or worse. And so you need to have a little bit more security in making that decision. A lot of these hospitals are running on stuff that's really quite antiquated and pretty old. And so they're looking to get up to modern technology. And so that's what they're looking for, is who has a track record of delivering consistently, could get me at least caught up with some modern technology. I want to have things integrated. I want my financials to talk with my clinicals. I want to be able to have my outpatient talk with my inpatient if that's applicable. So we see these organizations wanting that, but also trying to see how can we do that at an affordable price point. And so there's a few different options that you can have with that. You can say, well, look at Epic's Community Connect model, where you're using other Epic customers to host their instance out to you. You can look at Community Works, where you have a shared server and working with other customers in that way. Or you can look at a company like Meditech, where you're working directly with them. All those different models have their different pros and cons, and for each hospital, it's just, what do you want to pick? Do you want to pay a little bit more to have an individual relationship, or do you want maybe a little bit less robust functionality in the product, or do you want to have less customizability but a lower price point? There's all these different factors that go with each product you have to look at.
And help me understand, between those options, where do we see most providers ending up today in that space?
Yeah, so in the smaller hospital market, Cerner with their Community Works model seems to be the most compelling for our customers. We see them getting a lot in that space.
Okay. And I think that really just speaks to Cerner's approach of saying, hey, we're going to put you on a shared instance, but you still contract directly to us. Mm-hmm. If there's a problem, we can sort it out.
Yep.
And you still have that lifeline. Whereas Community Connect, your lifeline ultimately is only going to be as good as what that host site provides you. And many host sites, these provider organizations, they do a tremendous job. But some of them actually struggle putting together the strong support. So we see more variation.
To piggyback on what you're talking about with consistency, what we see with the Community Connect model, if you look at our data, is there is less consistency in the experience with Community Connect than there is if you contract directly with Epic. So that is something that does pull into a decision that a customer has to make to say, I'm getting Epic technology, but am I getting the full Epic experience? There is a difference to be had there. And so you have to look and weigh, is the benefits of that technology and maybe some integration and interoperability, are those the things that are pulling you towards that? And does that justify the increased costs that you may have to move with that? And maybe some headaches you may have around support depending on who your host site is.
Mm. And I know that Cerner in the large space, some of their customers have expressed challenges with the consistent experience they wish when you talk about bringing in Cerner patient accounting, right? Mm-hmm. And I know there's a lot of things Cerner's doing with Revelate to hopefully address that. That being said, for the smaller customers, do they experience those same frustrations with Cerner patient accounting?
Not nearly to the same extent. You look at the score breakdowns and the size of hospital, the larger you are, the more frustrating it can be working with patient accounting. But the smaller organizations are generally in a more safe space. I wouldn't say that they're over the moon with what they're using, but it's a lot less painful. And so they are getting by and they're saying, yeah, this is good enough for what we need it to do.
That's very helpful, because what turns out to be a linchpin for some of these large IDNs, all of a sudden, it's not necessarily the same challenge for these spaces, and hence why Cerner picks up so much market share there.
Yeah, so scaling is a little bit difficult for certain pieces of technology, and that's one of the things that we continue to look at with Cerner. We see them struggling in the financial side with those larger customers, and Metatech is still looking to get proof points in those larger customer bases and get more traction there.
So obviously this market's more than just Cerner, Epic, and Meditech. So help me understand some of the broader 5-year trends we've been seeing with some of the other vendors like CPSI, MetaHost, and AllScripts.
Yeah, so we are seeing a narrowing of the number of vendors that are playing in this space, which is really interesting, but also it's concerning if you're a customer. You want competition, you want there to be more fighting happening, and it's quickly becoming a 3-horse race. So as we look at what's happening over the last 5 years or so, you see Epic really winning hand over fist a lot of organizations. I mean, especially the number of organizations that are coming from these large deals, they're just getting a lot of business from that. We do see Cerner and Meditech trending in the right direction. They are continuing to gain market share, not nearly to the same extent, but like I say, with Expanse, that may go on more of an exponential curve. We'll be interested to see what happens with that. But there are other vendors where they're losing ground as a result of that. So AllScripts has been one that's actually seen a lot of losses. We saw them sunset their Horizon product. We've got Paragon, which is still being supported, but it's not as nearly as emphasized, and they've got Sunrise, but that's all in question now with the sale over to Harris. Question marks are around for customers of what's going to be the direction under new ownership.
Mm-hmm. And do we have any early indications on what may happen now that Harris owns AllScripts?
Nothing for sure. I mean, I think things are we're still waiting for the dust to settle. But what's interesting is talking with customers and seeing what are their sentiments around that. Anything like this, it causes concerns for customers where they have to say, where do I want to make my bets? If I have a contract that's going to be renewed, do I renew that and take a bet on something that's untested, or do I move over to something that maybe I've seen be a little bit more consistent? So it'll be really interesting seeing what happens with the AllScript space for a while, but they have been in a vulnerable state for quite some time. We've seen Sunrise and Paragon both losing customers for a while now, and so they're not trending in the right direction overall. And so to have more change like this happen, it's likely we're going to see more volatility in that customer base unless they are able to make some dramatic shifts.
That's an interesting thought, because here at Class, over the last 20 years, we've seen a lot of acquisitions.
A few.
But the fascinating thing about them is they're not necessarily bad or good. Mm-hmm. Really, what it really comes down to is what they end up doing with that solution over the long term. And it's just really fascinating to sit back and watch what's going to happen. The one thing we do know with every single acquisition and merger, the guarantee is there is change.
Yep.
So mergers and acquisitions over the long term here at Class, they're not necessarily bad or good. The one thing they do guarantee is change. Mm-hmm. And a market dominated by consistency, when you know, hey, these solutions, all I know right now is there's just a lot of questions and things are in flux, versus a solution that, hey, they have a roadmap, they've demonstrated things, there's a consistent performance. We tend to see providers trying to go with those consistent solutions.
And when you talk about a merger not being good or bad, we've seen both, right? We see good and bad, and so I think we need to make sure we say it can go either way. There's no one indicator that we've seen to say this is definitely going to be good, this is definitely going to be bad. There's always things that happen, but as we look at the totality of mergers that we've seen, it's pretty much a 50-50 split of if things work in a good direction or in a negative direction. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with AllScripts, and even with Cerner. I mean, they've got a lot of changes happening over there.
Absolutely. I mean, with Oracle coming in, making that offer, and now it's getting closer and closer to the actual finalization of that acquisition, it really is making opportunities more apparent, but also what's going to happen with some of those big questions around, hey, where's Feinberg taking this company? What are we doing with Revelate? And of course, where is Oracle going to focus future investment, and where are they going to pull back? Because when we talk about Cerner, this is probably their technology covers the most IT spaces in healthcare today of any vendor, even more than Epic. Mm-hmm. When you consider, hey, they actually go into some areas that the FDA covers, like blood bank and other things. Cerner is absolutely massive.
But we have seen them start to focus a little bit more. In areas like home health, where they say, you know what, we're not the best in the world at that. We're going to focus a little bit more on what we are great at. So like you say, it will be interesting to see, are there other areas that they need to pull back from and say we need to focus in on, or are they going to be able to continue to hold up everything they're doing? And what changes are going to come from the Oracle acquisition? That's probably been something that Cerner customers have been looking for a long time, is real change to happen. Cerner's been very consistent in their performance across all their different products, but never quite getting to that delighted stage where their customers are really just excited to be using what they're using. So it'll be interesting to see if any of these changes make that shift to where things do move in that direction. If things stay steady, if they move backwards, we just don't know yet.
Yeah, and ultimately, what determines whether something's successful or not is, hey, where are the future contracts? And I think that's why I love this report so much, is because it actually tells you in hard hard and fast numbers. This is where people contracted, this is where they didn't, and it gives you those numbers for the entire acute care market here in the U.S.
Yeah, it's not things that have necessarily landed, but they are contracted, and we know that that's where things are going to be moving. So we're going to see these shifts continue. So it'll be interesting seeing if the trend continues, where we see, speaking for Cerner specifically, do they continue to have large customers move away and pick up more of the small customers? Does that customer demographic change at all over the next year?
So historically, many of these small hospitals, and you said it, they're on a budget.
A tight one.
And there have been some historical leaders in that more budget space, the MedHost, the CPSIs out there. How are they performing?
Yeah, so what we've seen in the small hospital space is if you're looking for a budget product, your options are getting more narrow. So we see that both CPSI and MedHost, their market share is moving in the wrong direction. They're losing market share. Paragon is no longer really an option for a small hospital anymore. And so these cheaper solutions that had more basic functionality, they're just not keeping up as well. It seems like more and more organizations are willing to invest a little bit more to get a little bit better technology, to get more caught up with something that's more modern. So it's unfortunate if you are on a budget, your options really are getting more and more limited. CPSI still has the majority of market share as terms of in being a budget vendor. They still have the most customers that they're able to help with that. MedHost is still there. They've got a pretty stable base, but we don't see a lot of wins or losses coming from them. But anyone else, you're probably going to have to be looking at spending a little bit more in order to have an option if you are a small hospital.
One of the great things about this report, the longer we do it, the bigger trends you're able to see. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the great things that providers and vendors can jump in and dig into to get these insights. And of course, it's always great to chat with you to get the voiceover commentary of what these numbers mean and what's really the story behind them.
Yeah, there is a story there. You can't just look at the headlines. You can't just look at one little piece of information. If you really want to understand what's happening with this space, you need to look at all the pieces, because what one vendor may be good at, another may be bad at, and vice versa. And so you need to look for you specifically. What does it mean if I'm a specialty hospital? What does it mean if I'm a rural hospital? There's all these different factors that we look at to see how are these vendors performing, how are they trending. So it's a fun report for us to work on. Hopefully it's something that is benefiting the market. It seems like we get a lot of questions around this one, so it's fun. But we appreciate all the work that you do, because I know manning all the database for all this is no small task.
No, it's not. But it is totally worth it to the market. It's one of our most highly read reports each year. And of course, one of the great things about this report, Tyson, is that we do this each year. And so we're actually already, I think, getting into some of the validations for 2022. So thank you all for joining us. And if you have more questions, feel free to download the report or reach out to Tyson or myself. And thank you for joining us today.